In fact, if those things are synchronized, if there is a resonance between the orbit of the unseen planets and the alignment of the precessional Earth on the solstice with the galactic center, it's those two effects together which could, well, end everything that we know. And again, it is important, it behooves us to find out. Because in the worst case scenario, this would not be good, as Carl used to tell me, for beagles or begonias. Remember, we live on a world that is covered with water. It's not as deep as the oceans of Europa, but it's deep enough. If you move the Earth and you don't change all the constants in exactly the same phase synchronization to 0.0000000, however long you want that decimal string to run, the differential changes means you get what I call the bathtub effect. And we all know what that means. And that means a major motion picture from Roland Emmerich, right? Which, of course, brought up this set of questions, which I thought was dealt with pretty fairly in Rebecca's special. And this was the watchword for Emmerich's film. How would the governments of our planet prepare 6 billion people for the end of the world? Answer, they wouldn't. And that's just absolutely true. There's no way you would tell people this is what's coming, particularly if in your Newtonian world, in your Einsteinian relativistic perspective, there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it anyway. So why would you tell anybody? Because there is no safe place. If you're imagining there's a safe place to live on the Earth if this happens, no, you basically, as Rush Limbaugh would say, bend over and whatever. So, this, by the way, was the trailer. Now, Rob and I have not seen the film. If anybody here, how many have seen the film here? Okay. All right, well, don't spoil it for all the rest of us who are really looking forward to going and watch the world end. Okay. But I understand from certain esteemed critics that it's not bad. That, in fact, Roland does pull it off. He really makes the end of the world interesting. Yes. Only in America. All right. So the concept of 2012, to me, is inexorably connected with, is it possible that everything could change? And again, that's tabulated to what could happen in terms of an alignment with the center of the galaxy, which is here. On December 21, if you're hiding behind the Earth in a spacecraft, peeking over the North Pole, this is what you'd see. Here's the Earth, North Pole here, Sun here, and the galactic center is located right about there. Okay? Now, the critics say, oh, well, this happens every year, why is it such a big deal? Answer, another X factor. The other planets and the synchronization of orbits, resonance in the physics, or in this case, dissonance, causing the Earth to want to change that parameter, change that rotational axis. Which, of course, as I just noted, led us to here. These things are amazing, by the way, and they're so perfectly formed. I was really astonished with how modern-looking the architecture was. It almost looked like something out of, I don't know, Star Wars, which, of course, is where George Lucas went to shoot his scenes in Star Wars. These readings are so important because they are the first scientific evidence that, in fact, mass can change. And if mass can change on a rotating world, it means that this kind of interaction, this kind of interference pattern, this tremor in the force, in fact, could precipitate things that we really, really, really do not want to experience. Having said that, one of the things about the special that I was really intrigued with is how Michael Shermer, who is our resident skeptic, blatantly and casually dismissed torsion field physics as something I had made up, sitting in my pajamas in my basement typing on the internet or whatever. In fact, his direct quote was, "There's no such thing as torsion physics." Well, Michael obviously has not read the work of this guy, who under the Bushies was a high-level administrator in the Department of Defense and wrote for Tim Ventura's website a really amazing review of torsion field physics, where among other things, he talked about how you can create torsion fields, let me back up here, with plasmas. That's the polar aurora that the Hopi are talking about in terms of the warriors holding the snakes, because aurora look like snakes, as well as what happens with rotating bodies when they're exposed to adjacent rotating bodies. These spin fields, according to this DOD guy, can influence each other. And we live on a rotating body, right, in a solar system of other rotating bodies, in a galaxy of rotating. In other words, there is a real science here that we should and must pay attention to. Which brings us back, of course, to the special. One of the other things I was really gratified that they did do positively was that they included this amazing story. This is Major Maynard White, who was the head of, even though he was only a major, and they picked him because he had B-29 experience and mapping experience, and you'll see why that was important in a second. They picked him to head the first operational squadron of the newly formed Strategic Air Command under the newly formed, going to be newly formed, because this was actually done in 46, and didn't change the nomenclature till 47, what would ultimately become the Department of Defense. Then it was the War Department. So it was the Army Air Corps in the War Department was tasked through this guy to basically, from this building, take a squadron of aircraft and map the polar regions, setting up the parameters for the dew line, the pine tree line, all our early warning systems, because we were terrified in those days that the Earth was going to be overwhelmed, not by a pole shift, but by bad Russians. Those nasty Soviet commies were going to come across the pole and, undermine all our values, like Obama's going to change the country into a socialist communist nation now, with just about as much basis in fact. What was interesting is that in the middle of this book, which was written by Ken White, who is Maynard White's son, called World in Peril, which I think came by way of, well, there's a long history as to how I got this book, and I'm not going to go into it. I've been told I can't go into how I got this book. So I'm just going to have to leave you with the mystery. How did Hoagland know enough to get this book and read it? Because it was given to him, yes. Now, Robin gave it to me, but she doesn't want me to tell you how she knew it was important. Anyway, buried in the middle of what looks like a very dull, dry geopolitical treatise on the Cold War, and if there are 2,000 and some books written on Kennedy's death, there are millions that have been written on the Cold War. So, who needed another book on the Cold War to read? Well, because it was given to me by Robin, I dutifully started to read. And then in the middle of this book, I found the MacGuffin, that as part of their mapping, as part of their polar surveys, the 46th 72nd Squadron under Maynard White had found earth-shaking scientific discoveries. Okay. Such as, if you read the prologue, which I won't let you read, he says here that will reshape our planet and have a profound impact on our global society. And again, I'm wondering, is this just metaphorical geopolitical language? Because, those Air Force brats, they grew up in that culture, and you kind of breathe and sleep and eat it, and ultimately it winds up to be techno-speak in a geopolitical sense. However, as I read further, I discovered that as part of these reconnaissances, because you cannot use compasses in the polar regions. You're so close to the magnetic poles of the North and South Pole that you have to devise another navigation system totally, and they actually devised a system, invented it under Maynard White, called the grid system, which is even used now by all commercial airlines, pilots all over the world. When they're in the polar regions, they have to use a grid mapping system because the magnetic compasses, and this was in the days before such things as inertial nav systems, which are basically tied into the inertia of rotating, systems, gyroscopes and accelerometers and stuff like that. They had none of that stuff. So it was basically using star sites, sun sites, a grid mapping system, and not using magnetic compasses. And they found near the North Pole that something pretty amazing had happened. as they're looking into the limits of the magnetic compass, they found